Okay, we are live now. Welcome to the third edition of The Doctor Is In. You are tuning in from all over the world. And so I'm so excited where this is going. It's a regular series with a new edition every other Monday. The first two recordings are up on my YouTube channel, and fair warning, I'm still upskilling on the quality. But a couple housekeeping notes, starting with a 15-minute or so introduction to a topic about health and human trafficking. Then after my talk, I'll open up the time for you to ask questions about anything. Your question does not have to be related to the topic of the day. And you might ask your question verbally, or you may also type your questions into the chat box. So everyone should be muted, and I'm also asking everyone to turn off your video. And so this part of the recording, my talk, is recorded. And so if you don't want your face recorded on YouTube for posterity, then I suggest you turn off your video as well as mute yourself. Just another note, I've put the pertinent references to this talk in the chat box, and they'll also be available in the show notes as well as my blog. So today we're continuing the topic of prevention, and I'm going to start way upstream with the linkages between adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and changes in the brain and body of the child, how that impacts child development, which then leads to greater risk of victimization and or perpetration. So addressing ACEs is perhaps the strongest prevention strategy against human trafficking. As I mentioned before, human trafficking is preventable. And as a pediatrician, I'm quite keen on protecting children from being harmed in the first place. Rescue is important, but our primary focus really should be on prevention. So the article by Wood that's in your chat notes is that research regarding pre-trafficking vulnerabilities remains very limited. Simplified push and pull factor models of understanding why certain children are trafficked may mask complex and fluid interactions of cultural, societal, familial, economic, and intrinsic vulnerabilities. And so there's so much material on this, it's impossible to cover all of this today. So this is a very broad overview. In this space, I really see myself as working to be a bridge between the layperson and practitioner and the researcher or a medical clinician. So right from the top, what are ACEs? ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, comes from the CDC, or Center for Disease Control, Kaiser Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. This is also linked in the chat box. It's a groundbreaking public health study by Filidi and Anda that discovered that childhood trauma leads to the adult onset of chronic diseases, depression, other mental illness, violence, and being a victim of violence, as well as financial and social problems. The ACE study has published about 70 research papers since 1998. Hundreds of additional research papers based on the ACE study have also been published. So the ACE questionnaire is 10 questions long and covers the following incidences before age 18: physical, sexual, and verbal abuse, physical and emotional neglect, a family member who is depressed or diagnosed with other mental illness, addicted to alcohol or another substance, or in prison. Another factor is witnessing a mother being abused, or losing a parent to separation, divorce, or other reason. A link to the website with the exact questions is also in the chat box and show notes. The higher the ACE score, the more likely the person is to have more and more severe health consequences. So other ACE surveys have expanded the types of ACEs to include other forms of violence. But here's a slide that shows, I'm going to share my screen and show you the basic trajectory of adverse childhood experiences. So from conception to from conception to death, we have these mechanisms. So you have ACEs, which then disrupt the neurodevelopment, which then cause social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. And then you have adoption of health risk behaviors. Some of this is self-medication for these impairments. Then more disease, more disability, and more social problems follow, and then an early death. So that's the basic pyramid mechanism screen that the original study showed. And so there's a lot of negative effects of ACEs. And here's another, let me get back and I'll share another slide with you. So here is another PDF that shows the adverse childhood experiences from birth to 18. And then that goes to the impact of trauma and health risks, easing the pain of the trauma. And then the long-term consequences of unaddressed trauma. And so this is a one-page summary also from the original study. So I'll also be sharing that. So, but we're going to start really at the neurodevelopmental impacts today. And so a lot of the negative effects of ACEs relate to epigenetic changes. Maybe you've heard of epigenetics or not, but epi means above in Greek. And so our DNA is our genome. Those are those acid-base pairs that we see in that double helix. And the epigenome consists of the structures and chemical compounds that have been attached to the DNA or the genome and can regulate the activity or the expression of the genes within the genome, such as turning a gene on or off. Epigenetic modifications do not change the DNA sequence, but it affects the activity of that gene. So epigenetic modifications remain as cells divide, and in some cases they can be inherited throughout the generations. So it's more than your DNA itself that's inherited, it's also changes to the epigenome, which is really fascinating. And so the environmental influences, such as a person's diet, exposure to pollutants, and of course, exposure to trauma can also impact the epigenome. And I'm going to go into some specific examples of that today. So it seems obvious, and it's well known and well documented that ACEs have negative consequences for children in their near and not so near and adult futures, including addiction, poor school performance, negative health outcomes. Therefore, ACEs also contribute to the vulnerabilities to victimization as well as perpetration, sometimes both in a single individual. I'm going to go through some of the internal mechanisms through which these occur. It's a very exciting time in the science of neuro-bio-psychology because we can measure changes on a cellular level. We can measure the connectivity between brain structures, and then based on these changes, then describe behavioral outcomes of these changes. It's important to study this so we know how to prevent it, but also we can reassure and validate survivors that they are not crazy. They're actual physical changes in their brains that need recovery. It's not just all about their willpower or their own ability to make decisions. So in summary, the external events have internal consequences. These consequences are long-lasting and can persist through generations. And these internal changes have their own external consequences in terms of developmental difficulties, health problems, mental health issues. So there's 4 domains of child development. There's cognitive, which is problem solving, communication, concentration. There's physical, which is musculoskeletal, fine and gross motor skills. There's emotional development, which in terms of self-regulation and handling fear. And then the social development, which is developing safe relationships, social engagement and interaction. And there's a growing evidence in the field of developmental neurobiology, several interesting factors that negatively influences children. And so I'm going to outline some of these here for you. And so point 1 is that trauma can have generational impacts. You've heard of generational trauma. There's some fascinating studies being done in the generations of Aboriginals and also survivors of Holocaust. I'm not going to get into all the details here. We can in a future episode. What's really interesting is that the impacts of parental, such as moms and dads, the impacts of parental ACEs are also felt in their offspring. That means that behavioral effects are not just through biological, but also indirect through epigenetic changes. And I quote in the article by Racine, also, which is referenced in the chats. Racine states that mothers who experienced more ACEs experienced more health risks in pregnancy, and in turn had infants who were born with more infant health risks, which were associated with poor developmental outcomes at 12 months. So moms with their own childhood ACEs had children who were developmentally challenged. Another study showed that children of parents, and they surveyed both moms and dads, who had early life adversity have developmental challenges at age 2 years. So it's not just the moms, it's also dads who have early childhood adversity that is also impacting their children. Pretty profound. So there are some neurochemical and biological changes in children that are irreversible, such as the effects on hormone receptors. Children who suffer abuse and neglect have shortened telomeres. Now, telomeres are the part of the epigenome, the part that's on top of your genes. They protect your genes from damage and aging. The earlier the trauma, the more severe the psychological outcomes. Social support, now this is good news, social support from caregivers, teachers, and other adults has protective effects so that there's an interplane between gene and environment that's important for the expression of both negative as well as positive resilience outcomes following childhood trauma. And so it's not a foregone conclusion that a child with adversity will automatically be severely messed up. These systems are complex, and this gives us hope. So physical brain development is negatively impacted by childhood adversity. I'm talking about myelination. That's the fat that goes on your nerves that increase the connectivity as well as the speed of processing of your brain. It impacts the connections as well as the size and structure of brain regions, such as hippocampus, which helps in memory, amygdala, which is your fear center, corpus callosum, and other frontal lobe areas. So they can measure actual physical changes in the brain due to trauma. The sympathetic nervous system, which is our stress response system, is tailored to address fear and trauma rather than exploration and learning. Oxytocin, which has to deal with interpersonal relationships, empathy, and attachment. That is negatively impacted by trauma, but is also influenced positively in developing resilience with supportive relationships. Serotonin, which has to do with our moods, our behaviors, and other physiological functions, is also impacted. The immune system, which is negatively impacted, which leads to more susceptibility to infections, autoimmune diseases, and other inflammatory conditions. Cognitive development can be delayed or disrupted, leading to lower IQ, language deficiencies, concentration difficulties, and memory problems. We can also see deficiencies in executive function, and executive function helps us with our decision-making, our sense of self. It also leads to dissociative problems. One area that I have found absolutely fascinating lately is that there's gender differences in that the influences of stress hormones in pre- and perinatal periods are experienced differently by girls and boys. So listen, Boys are more at risk, not less. They are less resilient, not more. They need more input and help from their caretakers, especially mom, than girls. So a quote from Alan Shore, who has a summary article in your show notes. Boys are more vulnerable to maternal stress and depression in the womb, birth trauma, that is separation from mother, and unresponsive caregiving, such as caregiving that leaves them in distress. Shore's work suggests that differences between the sexes in brain wiring patterns that account for gender differences in social and emotional functions are established at the very beginning of life. The developmental programming of these differences is more than genetically coded, but epigenetically shaped by the early social and physical environment, and that the adult male and female brains represent an adaptive complementary for optimal human function. So for more on that, you can click on that link in the chat box. So there seems to be a relationship between the type of trauma and gender. Neglect has been shown to have a strong association with smaller corpus callosum size in boys, while sexual abuse was strongly linked to a smaller corpus callosum in girls. The lack of fathers through death, imprisonment, or abandon in the home has a negative impact on the telomeres of boys. In one study, by the age of 9 years old, boys who had absent fathers had significantly shorter telomeres than boys who had fathers who were present in their early life. Maltreated males may be more likely to be arrested for violent offenses as adults, thus becoming prisoners, and therefore less likely to be involved in research studies. This fact can lead to a selection bias in retrospective studies and a possibly mistaken idea that females are more vulnerable to early trauma. Early trauma experiences may lead to greater changes in stress responses in males compared to females, findings that are commonly seen in individuals with antisocial behavior. And so that I just find this really interesting, especially when we're considering research in as far as trauma in males and females. So I'm going to share another slide with some take-home messages. So let's share my screen. And take-home message, oh, there we go. Take-home messages. What is going too fast? Trauma and adversity in childhood causes, sometimes permanent, changes in brains and bodies of children. These changes cause ripple effects in a child's development that make them more vulnerable to health problems and continued adversity, including being victims or perpetrators of exploitation and trafficking. Childhood adversity is preventable. We can implement widespread public health measures such as prenatal visits, screening for maternal and paternal mood disorders and other psychological problems. We should strengthen families, support through public health, religious communities, etc. We should ensure a strong start for children. I mean, it's education, nutrition, safety, mentoring. But there's a bunch of studies that are showing that it's really important that we have strong and caring adults to build resilience in these children. So making better decisions as young adults is not simply a matter of behavior or choosing to do the right thing, and certainly not just saying no. This information is useful for psychoeducation of survivors so that they can understand that they are fighting a physiology in their brains in their recovery, and that it's not just a matter of will to get better. And DeBellis in that report says, a society that places its focus on an infrastructure of primary prevention would be choosing the less costly option for victims and for itself. And Wood, in the article from BMJ Peds, is healthcare professionals are also encouraged to have influence, where possible, beyond the care of individual patients. Research, health insights, advocacy, and promotion of a survivor input enhances the collaborative development of evidence-based approaches to prevention, intervention, and aftercare of affected children and families. So that pretty much resumes my talk. And so the course applies not just to healthcare professionals, but to everyone. So here's a very quick overview of adverse childhood experiences, so important in a healthy society and not just preventing trafficking in persons. And so I am going to officially stop recording this.